episode 148. This is a weekly diary podcast hosted by me, Ray Taylor. I want to highlight something that I'm thankful for. And in this episode, I am thankful for a podcast that inspired me to start podcasting way back in like 2007 or 2008. And the podcast that I am thankful for that no longer exists, but was one of my favorite shows, the Totally Rad Show, which at the time was a HD video podcast that I subscribed to through iTunes. This was before YouTube did long-form HD video. They didn't do HD video, and they didn't do longer than 10 minutes. I think they were capped out back then. So subscribing through iTunes, and this is before streaming services were around, subscribing to this podcast through iTunes was the only way to get HD video programming. And I didn't have cable at the time. Streaming services didn't exist. I think it was the early days of the South Park website that started up. And then pretty soon around there, Hulu kind of started up, which probably means that Netflix was probably a streaming service. But I didn't have any of those services at the time. But Totally Rad Show, amazing show. I had three hosts, three dudes were the hosting of this show. And they reviewed movies and video games and comic books and other nerd-esque things. It was the second podcast that I ever subscribed to. The first podcast was Dignation, which was hosted by Kevin Rose and Alex Albrecht. Alex Albrecht also co-hosted the Totally Rad Show. He was one of the three co-hosts. The other two, along with Alex Albrecht, is the director of Prey, Dan Trachtenberg, and one of the co-hosts of the Filmcast, Jeff Kanata. So Jeff, Dan, and Alex were the three hosts of Totally Rad Show, and it was a fun show I looked forward to every week, despite the fact that I didn't play video games, despite the fact that I did not read comic books. I love their movie reviews. I love their chemistry as hosts. They are three friends that have known each other for a long time, and it's just a show that I loved and was super sad when it ended. Right? It was. They did a lot of different segments. They had some fun segments that weren't necessarily part of their reviews. Like they did one was Dan Becomes a Man, where there'd be these things, these challenges for Dan Trachtenberg to do that would, kind of make him more of a man. One of them was they went on a trip to the UK, right, to film some special episodes. I think they were part of a convention or something like that. I don't really know why they were in the UK, but they were in the UK. And one of the Dan Becomes a Man segments that is forever burned in my brain as being one of the funniest things, one of the moments that made me laugh extremely hard, was Dan trying to drink tea the proper way. And the amount his hand would shake while attempting to drink tea the proper way was to hold the teacup in the proper way, to drink it and replace it, and his inability to control himself, his inability to stop laughing, his inability to stop shaking, was something that I relate to quite a bit. I took a glass torching class once, and my hands never shook more than when I was trying to just make basic glass beads. It was ridiculous. And Dan's hand as it shook trying to drink tea was a spitting image of the ridiculous nature that was me trying to make glass beads. But it's a show that also introduced me to stuff like geocaching. They did like these marathon episodes to raise money for charity, where they would play board games and other things, which inspired me to do the 24-hour podcast. That was a charity-based podcast that I did 2 episodes of. This is the show that their show inspired me to start podcasting. Was my first podcast, the Billy Dallas Show, where I played a character Only did 6 episodes. It was video podcast. I didn't have an audio version, but it was available through iTunes. The Billy Dallas Show, and I played a character who wanted to be a roadie for Atmosphere, moved to LA, and then found out Atmosphere is in Minneapolis, so he wanted to become internet famous so he can make money to move from LA to Minneapolis, which was the premise of the Billy Dallas Show. And to be internet famous, he reviewed movies that were like old movies. He reviewed the internet like he was he's kind of a hillbilly, ignorant type of a character that was sincere in his reviews, but also it was a comedy. 100% inspired by the Totally Rad Show. I remember communicating with Jeff Kanata via email, telling him about it, and he checked it out, and that was like a highlight of my life back then. And then later on, Dan Trachtenberg, the director of Prey, the director of 10 Cloverfield Lane, before he was a director, was Dan Trachtenberg from... That's why if you go to his Twitter handle, it's Danny TRS. TRS stands for Totally Rad Show. He was a guest on another movie podcast and brought it up at the end of one of the episodes of TRS to recommend people check out the guest appearance he had on this audio podcast about movies, which at the time was called the Slash Filmcast. And that is the podcast, the first audio-only podcast I subscribed to around 2008, and is a podcast that I still subscribe to. It is now called the Filmcast. They parted ways with the movie website Slash Film and are now just the Filmcast. And now the 3 co-hosts of that show include Jeff Kanata, which at the time was somebody else. So after TRS ended, Jeff Kanata went and became one of the 3 co-hosts of the Filmcast. So they're podcasts that have not only started my podcast career that is going on 14 plus years now. I mean, even more than that. When did I start? 2008. So almost 15 years. But also got me into other podcasts. And it's amazing. And, it was always a highlight of my week when a new episode of TRS came out. Towards the end of their run, they started... it was a show that had multiple segments within it. It was like an hour and a half long show. They decided towards the end to split it up into, I think it was a daily show, but it was split up into smaller episodes. Each segment was a different episode. And that was like before it ultimately ended, which was a bummer. I love that show, but Dan Trachtenberg, obviously, he got into directing movies. Like a lot of people were kind of going their separate ways. And it's awesome to still, to this day, listen to Jeff Kanata talk about movies, which was the main thing I loved. And it was also, they did one of the segments they did on Totally Rad Show was Versus, where they went to a website called Flickchart that still exists. And Flickchart basically gives you 2 movies and you decide which movie you like better in order to kind of make a list of your favorite movies just by competing, seeing which ones, different matchups, seeing how you rate. And they had a segment called Versus where all 3 of them had to agree on which of the 2 movies, which made for a great discussion, which ended up becoming a segment of my old show, the Inspired Disorder podcast, in a segment called the Ultimate Movie Championship, where my co-host Keith and I did the same thing. We basically played Versus, went to Flickchart, and were given 2 movies. We decided which of the 2 movies is better, and that built our ultimate movie list. And then for any movie that one of us hadn't seen, populated a list of shame, and very exact to how the TRS guys did. So it's a show that has inspired me in podcasting in many ways over the years, whether it's the 24-hour podcast for charities, to raise money for charities, for the segment of using Flickchart, all of these things. So amazing. And it's amazing to see Trachtenberg make some of my favorite movies, one of my favorite movies last year in Prey, one of the best, if not the best, Predator movie, in my opinion, but the best. and then also seeing Jeff Kanata continue to put out amazing content, and just it's amazing. I love it, and they are forever a highlight. The Totally Rad Show will always be a highlight in my journey as a creative person. And I love them forever. And every segment, they ended with a fist bump. They always had really fun production. The different producers they had over the years were always kind of a character themselves in the fun producing. I mean, everything was done on green screen. There's a lot of like animated stuff. There's a lot of aspects of how Totally Rad Show is produced that have influenced this show. In some ways, I don't go as fun and spend as much time as they do to flash stuff up. But at the end of every segment they did, they would all do a fist bump that would cause an explosion, which I really loved. And their signature send off for each segment, and a great. Which, if you're watching this, that's what they're doing above me, right?
New episodes of The Ray Taylor Show come out every single day. Subscribe on YouTube and everywhere our podcasts are found. Binge the full week over at InspiredDisorder.com/plus. Buy Ray Taylor Show merch over at InspiredDisorder.com. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Peace out!
Today is the day where you wake up and you realize that everything that you've been dreaming about, everything that you've been wanting, every goal and wish and hope that you've ever had can become real. Dreams can come true. What you manifest in your mind, you can bring to reality.